Hi, I'm Derrick Jensen. This is Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network. My guest today is Jeremy Lent. He's an author and founder of the nonprofit Liology Institute, dedicated to fostering a worldview that could enable humanity to thrive sustainably on the Earth. The Liology Institute, which integrates systems science with an ancient wisdom traditions, holds regular workshops and other events in the San Francisco Bay Area. In addition to the patterning instinct, Jeremy is author of the novel Requiem of the Human Soul. Formerly, he was the founder, CEO, and chair of a publicly traded internet company. He holds a BA in English Literature from Cambridge University and an MBA from the University of Chicago. So first, thank you for being on the program again. And second, thank you for your work.
Thank you, Derek. It's always such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Well, thanks. It's a pleasure to talk with you, too. So today, you and I have planned on talking about how corporate capitalism, or the dominant culture more broadly, co-opts everything. But before we get there, can you reintroduce the patterning instinct, both the book and the concept, because I'm sure that's a concept we'll be talking about through the rest of the interview.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely, Derek. So the book itself is called The Patterning Instinct, with the subtitle, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, which pretty much describes what the book is about. It kind of looks at the different ways in which cultures have made sense of the universe, all the way from earliest hunter-gatherer times to our present day. And in fact, even looking out into the ways in which the kinds of meaning we make may affect the future, which I think, is going to be really relevant to our conversation today. And so the patterning instinct itself is what I describe as the kind of instinct that we humans have, that we have to a far greater degree than other mammals. And it's really the identifying characteristic that makes humans unique among all other creatures. And it's an instinct that both it kind of works in this way that it drives us to find meaning out of everything around us. So you can imagine just think of a little baby who hears these sounds around her and feel and touches and everything. Nobody says to her, you've got to learn language. But because of this instinct to pattern meaning into everything around her, she learns how to speak and how to become part of her culture. So it's an instinct that humans applied from the earliest days, as when we first had language, maybe a couple 100,000 years ago or so, to look at everything around, like the stars, nature, what was going on, and try to make some meaning out of it and create stories about the universe. And those are the underlying foundational structures of thought that led to different cultures and ultimately led to bifurcation of cultures into the culture that became dominant today. So today, of course, we use our patterning instinct in very different ways. But for all of us, it's what we use to make sense of things. But what's so critical is that it's our culture that we're born into that really shapes how we make sense of the world. So a big part of the book is helping us to recognize, it's almost like an archaeology of the mind, if you will, helping us to recognize where some of the things that we take for granted, where these ideas actually came from, with the idea that maybe by recognizing them, we become more free to be able to really question them and perhaps even shift our values and our meaning making to something that might be more harmonious for ourselves and for our place in the earth.
So thank you for that. And you've done a wonderful job of introducing, I think, the instinct in itself. And can you give, so I'm going to say a silly example, and then can you give examples of, you think, sort of helpful or harmful patterns that we perceive? And you can disagree with the word helpful and harmful too. That's perfectly fine. But I'm thinking of, I mean, obviously language is an example of the patterning instinct sort of going right, that a child learns to speak, or that the parent knows that if the child is crying, that means there's something wrong with the child and something needs to be fixed. And then I'm also thinking, and I don't want to disrespect lucky socks, but, one can, if a baseball player is in a slump and then they get 3 hits and then they don't change their socks and they wear the same socks the next day and get 3 hits again, they could end up wearing the same socks for the entire hitting streak.
I love it.
I love it. Which may I mean, once again, I don't want to disrespect Lucky Socks, but that may be a time where you're seeing a pattern. Oh, I know a great example. A better example is the causation versus correlation thing, that you can go, gosh, have you ever noticed that there are a lot of firemen or firefighters? There are a lot of firefighters at a fire. Firefighters must cause fires.
Right.
And so you've got the pattern, but you've seen it backwards. So I'll shut up now. And can you sort of talk about helpful, harmful, spurious, non-spurious?
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, in a way, we can sort of go one layer deeper in looking at what you're raising, and just think about what is a pattern in itself. Like, think for example about, like, you look at the night sky. There's gazillions of stars out there. And if anyone has, taught you your constellations, or basically every culture, looks at those stars and they identify constellations, and that's like a great example of patterns. But when you make a pattern, you're doing two things. You're including certain things in that pattern, and you're excluding the stuff that doesn't fit in that pattern. And it's part of the way our patterning instinct works, that once we've created that pattern, we think in terms of it, which means we keep looking just at the stuff that fits in that pattern. And other stuff that doesn't fit in that pattern, we kind of ignore until maybe it becomes so critically extreme that we have to kind of change our pattern, if you will, in order to kind of include that. And so it's something important to realize that essentially any way in which we make meaning, I love some of your examples, but any way we do that is never like 100% right, because by making the pattern, we're sort of framing things and we're sort of fitting some things in, some things out. A great example is actually to go back to language. So, yeah, like you say, language is incredibly important for an infant to learn her own culture's language. And what they found by studying really sophisticated tests on studying infants, that as early as 9 months, a baby has learned to notice the sounds natural to her country's language and ignore those that don't fit in that language. So, for example, we know that somebody who's been born and raised in Japan has trouble distinguishing between L and R sound, which to us in English is kind of obvious. But because there's no distinction to that in Japanese language, their patterning instinct basically just wipes that out. So what's so important, of course, about that is that when we look at, say the ways in which we make meaning out of the world today, or the way the dominant culture makes meaning out of the world, it does the same thing. We can look at a certain pattern, and somebody in the dominant culture might see one thing, and somebody from a different cultural complex might see something completely different.
A really great example of that in my own life is that I was raised, like most of us in this current culture, to believe that natural selection is based on strict competition, and it's basically survival of the meanest and fittest. And I remember when John Livingston, I read his book and then interviewed him, and he argued that evolution is in many ways based on cooperation and fitting in to your niche in the larger community. And when he first said that, I was thinking, God, he's crazy. That makes no sense at all. And it took a few years for me to sort of come around to see it, to see it. And now when I look at the natural world, I see all these examples of cooperation more than I see the examples of the specific sort of strict competition. And I'm just saying that I used to see it one way, and then it was through other people pointing out patterns that had never occurred to me that I was able to start seeing it differently.
Yes, and what you are describing is what I see is actually one of the fundamental, foundational false kind of flaws, if you will, of what our modern civilization's worldview is based on. And it's really a huge, it's not just something that relates to biology or evolution. It's something that people have inculcated in their lives. And there's this sense that somehow because of this belief that evolution works through this, what Richard Dawkins famously called the selfish gene, that actually it's okay for humans to be selfish. And in fact, that's one of the fundamental philosophical sort of justifications, if you will, for capitalism. Well, since we're all selfish, just like the way the world works out there, evolution works through everyone, just through each gene and every animal trying to do its thing and to be as competitive as possible. So capitalism is basically like the most efficient way for humans to evolve their society. And it's completely flawed. And yet it's so powerful for people to justify the incredibly unfair and destructive, basic economic system we live in now. So I do think that's one of the foundations. And in fact, I've gotten in hot water in the last year or so by writing articles about what I call the dangerous delusions of Richard Dawkins. And people get so upset, and a lot of them email me back and say, he doesn't support selfishness. He's really a good person, and you shouldn't attack him like that. And I'm sure, I totally believe he's a good person. I have no real question about that. But he's really been propagating bad science that has been outmoded now for decades. And that science has served as a foundation for people believing a lot about, like, applying it to economics and capitalism in a very false way. Even highly intelligent people, this is not something that people do without thinking about it. And I think it's very dangerous.
What's that line from the end of Casablanca? I think this is the start of a beautiful friendship.
Right. Exactly.
I really agree with you on that. So before we go to how does capitalism co-opt everything, which, you've really given us a good entree to, and I should probably take it, but instead I want to do one more little parenthetical comment, which is something. Also, the world itself is so complex, and there is so much information out there. Like you said, there are bazillions of stars, and we have to choose some and leave out others in order to perceive, the Hunter or the Big Dipper or anything else. We have to Orion, the Hunter. It is possible to project. Life is so complex that it's possible to project so many different patterns onto it, and even completely mutually exclusive patterns onto it, because the patterns that we can recognize are so less complex than the real world.
Yes, I think that's true. And in a way, that kind of leads into the way in which if we look at the sort of modern mainstream way of looking at the world, making sense of it, ultimately it's something we can identify as what's called reductionism. And it's this way of saying, like, essentially, starting with the scientific revolution hundreds of years ago, some of the most brilliant minds would look at this complexity and they'd say, we want to try to understand it. And at the time, they were the progressive ones who were really, like, moving things forward. And they'd say, in order to understand it, we need to break it down. Think of it like a machine and reduce it to its specific parts so that we can really understand how these work. And so cut this out, look at this, separate it from that, and we'll understand it better. And by doing that, by looking at things, by separating things out, thinking of them like an incredibly complex machine, they did amazing things. I mean, they basically came up with these sort of scientific understanding of the universe, leading to these amazing technologies, a lot of which we all, take so much pleasure from. Even right now, we have to recognize the fact you and I are able to talk and we're able to share our ideas with people listening here, through technology that only developed as a result of this kind of reductionist, approach. But the thing is, they were so successful in what they did that they began to think that what their pattern of separation they were applying meant that the whole universe was that. They kind of mistook a particular technique to learn how to manipulate the natural world around them and started to believe that technique was the actual reality. And by doing that, they lost the ways in which things connect. So one of the ways in which I think we have hope for the future is to focus our attention on the kind of, if you will, the ways in which things connect up rather than the ways in which they're separate. And that leads to fundamental shifts in our worldview. And I think really also relates a lot to the different ways in which earlier indigenous and traditional cultures around the world made sense of the world. They saw this kind of amazing distinction between, on the one hand, there's so much disparate, incredible complexity to the world. On the other hand, they sensed something unifying that pulled it all together. That was sometimes called the riddle of the one and the many. And many different cultures tried to come up with a story of the universe that were sort of incorporated the one and the many. And that's something that our mainstream reductionist viewpoint has absolutely lost. And that if we want to get to a flourishing place, we have to find that again.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'm thinking a couple things. One of them is that maybe 10 or 11, oh God, I'm getting old. It's like 14 years now. 14 years ago now, I wrote this thing. I was by a stream and I wanted to write about what a stream is. You know, when we give definitions, the definitions are, by definition, this is here and this is there. There is a square and there is the space inside the square and the space outside the square, and the lines delineate. And that's real. That's true. And then at the same time, I wanted to define a stream by its relationships rather than by here is the water, here is the bank. Because I've been talking to some people who really know rivers, and they were saying we misdefine rivers because a river doesn't end at the bank, it reaches underground, and it's also flowing under the bottom of the bank. And then where does the water end and the mist above it begin, the solid water? I mean, there's this permeability. And so that really helped me to try to start perceiving, yes, there is where I am sitting is not in a stream. That there is a stream and a not stream, but that doesn't alter the fact that the boundaries between stream and not stream are not quite so rigid as we believe.
That is so true, Derrick, and of course that relates to the self. You know, another of these sort of foundational views coming in our mainstream dominant culture from essentially a couple of millennia of Western thought is that the self is this very fixed entity, and that the self is completely separate from another self, and as the human self is separate from nature. And I think part of what we need to do is recognize, just like you were describing the river there so beautifully, that there's actually this really fluid interactivity, that in fact what I am as a self doesn't end at my skin, and how I'm just physically I'm absorbing things and putting things out there in the universe all the time. But even then, even at a deeper place, in terms of this kind of connectivity, the things that I do, the things that I hear, everything is affecting me and shifting who I am. And just any single word, any single activity that I do out there puts out these ripples that becomes part of the world around us. And actually, once you begin to see the world in terms of connectivity rather than separation, you begin to realize that there is no kind of fixed self, that this is amorphous, just like the river. And humans, in the same kind of way, are just a part of the natural world. Even as we're destroying it, we're also part of it in a way that makes it so much more complex.
So that seems like a good place, for me at least, it seems like a good place for us to transition into how the dominant culture co-opts everything, because I agree with everything you're saying, and it was just beautifully put and wonderful. And then I have also seen people basically argue then, for example, that because humans are part of the natural world, therefore the fact that humans are killing the oceans is okay and natural. And
yes.
So we don't, if you want to, we can talk about that specific example. But what I really want to get to is it doesn't matter what idea we're talking about. I mean, Christianity is such a great example that you have, let's pretend that Jesus is real for a second. It doesn't matter if he was or not. And, he's saying love your neighbor as yourself, and he's talking about all this, all this peace, love, groovy stuff. And within 400 years, or 300, however long it took, you've got Constantine saying, let's go out and conquer under the sign of the cross. And you have untold millions of people dying, indigenous people giving the choice of Christianity or death. So it doesn't matter. We can talk about, love, or we can talk about this connection, but there's this, it seems to me that you are the person in the entire world to talk to about how this pattern and instinct leads to the co-optation of everything. Do you see what I'm trying to get at?
I do. No, I absolutely do. And I do think, in a way, that the book, The Patterning Instinct, really is tracing, it's almost like a detective story, tracing how this happened from where humans first evolved to where we are now. And I do think that you can actually detect a few very key stages. And I'll just I'll name them briefly, but I want to kind of focus on the later stages. I don't want to go into too much detail on the earlier ones, but there's this kind of stage of when humans developed this advanced prefrontal cortex, giving us this patterning instinct, and developed language and stuff like that, giving us essentially an imbalance of power over the natural world, so that even hunter-gatherers who saw the world as like a giving parent and saw themselves as just in harmony with nature caused some of the greatest mass extinctions in all of the Earth's history. So we have to look at that as an imbalance created from humanity's unique sort of powers of this patterning instinct. Then the next big stage is when agriculture first arose about 12,000 years ago, which caused this major separation between human and nature, and between humans and other humans, and ownership and hierarchy, and a lot of the things that we take for granted now, only really 12,000 years old in human history. And then the next big step came really with the scientific revolution in Europe around the 17th century. And that's where I want to sort of begin to focus a little more, because along with that scientific revolution was this kind of this Puritan value system of where the sort of the individual and really making wealth and using private property, like improving the land, was considered to be sort of God's fulfilling God's command on this earth, which became a fundamental value structure for the United States, as Puritans and Protestants were some of the earlier people to invade and colonize the country and take it away from the indigenous people who lived here. And I do think that we have to look at those underpinnings to really get a sense then as to what's happened right now, how those layers of thoughts kind of arose. And because I think it's really around the beginning of the 20th century, like late 19th and earliest 20th century in the US, that you see the rise of what's become this massive global corporate takeover of humanity that we're experiencing in the world today. So that's just from a really big picture point of view, the way I sort of see how things develop stage by stage to where we are now.
And how does okay, I'm going to throw out a cynical statement that I say when I am feeling not particularly optimistic about the future, which is that sometimes it feels to me like humans spend a lot of our intellectual energy rationalizing our pre-existing, I'll use a nice word, predilections, rationalizing what we want to do anyway, and as opposed to actually thinking through a subject. And there's another thing here too, which is I always think about how, okay, they ended chattel slavery in the United States in 1865, and then it didn't take very long for the Jim Crow laws to be put in place. And then once they started getting rid of the Jim Crow laws, you sort of have the prison industrial complex arising. And it's like every time you succeed, it's like whack-a-mole. Every time you stop one form of, and this relates to the co-optation. I'm sorry this is such a broad and sort of terrible question, but it feels like there's a connection between this co-optation question and this question of underlying bigotries ending up manifesting again. And we can, of course, talk about this in terms of hatred of the natural world, too. Well, so see, one of the things that gets to me is that over the last 30 years, the environmental movement has really been co-opted from being about trying to save wild places and wild beings into sustainability, by which is meant by the sort of technotopians sustaining this culture. So somehow the environmental movement has been co-opted into serving the high-tech system. And so how does the patterning instinct relate to this? Do you see what I'm trying to get at? Relate to this sort of constant co-optation. Is this making any sense?
Yes, I do. I mean, I totally get what you're saying, and it's something I think we touched on when we talked last time, is how you know, even where we've seen major shifts in cultural norms, and like you say, the great example is the end of slavery, which just kind of turned into another boon for capitalism. And then even in the last few decades, you know, we had real shifts away from sort of patriarchal value structures since the 1960s and 70s, and that's, you know, great progress culturally. And yet somehow the capitalist system will just absorb any kind of shift that happens culturally and go, great, and let's just sort of make this another way to, you know, start some new disruptive company that makes billions of dollars and destroys the earth in some new way. So I do think that to look at how that happens, we have to look at what are the underlying structures that enable it. And I think that as I look at what evolved in the last 120 or so years since the beginning of the 20th century, we see a couple of things. One is this implicit acceptance of the notion of the corporation as being an entity that is necessary and valuable in our world. So now everyone sort of thinks, well, the only way the things work is you have to have corporations doing stuff for us. And look what happened with communism. You know, what a disaster that was. And as if the only two choices out there for the global economy for humans to organize themselves are capitalism or communism. And, you know, parenthetically, communism was just as intent on destroying the natural world as capitalism, every bit as much. So when you look at that, you begin to realize, well, why, I mean, you can ask these questions. Why is it considered acceptable for this kind of artificial entity called a corporation to be created to serve just the ends of making more money for its shareholders with no other ethical obligation whatsoever? How could we allow that? And I think that is one of that's sort of become this tenet of capitalism, that you have to allow these gigantic corporations and give them the power to do what they want to do. And I think that that's really one of the major things we have to look at. You know, I wrote an article just a few months ago talking about, you know, like a lot of the time you'll read the newspapers nowadays, and some of the leading sort of scientific thinkers will be talking about the risk of AI taking over, artificial intelligence. And, you know, there's this kind of theory that, you know, if we develop we can try to develop an artificial intelligence that is there for humanity's good, but there's a risk that it can be so powerful that if its goals can be different from humanity, and then it could end up destroying the world. And there's this one futurist called Nick Bostrom who gives this example of, well, supposing we develop a superintelligence with just the goal of manufacturing paperclips, and then it transforms the entire Earth into a gigantic paperclip manufacturing facility. And that's what they're worried about. And my article basically said, you know, it's already happened. Artificial intelligence has taken over and is called the corporation. We created this structure of our society that gives this incredible power beyond any kind of political organization, beyond any kind of government, to essentially turn the world into a gigantic paperclip, which in this case is commoditizing the world to create more and more shareholder value, as they call it, returns to investors by essentially taking human activity, taking the natural world, and transforming it into the monetized economy. And that's what's out of control. And until we look at some of the structural levers to control that, I think we're going to keep that's what can take over everything, including environmentalist groups, as you point out.
So I think everything you said is completely brilliant, and I love it. It's so great. And I'm going to focus on maybe in some ways the most innocuous word, or maybe the most dangerous word that I think you said in that whole beautiful commentary, which is at one point you said the word somehow. And I mean, do you see where I'm going with this? That you
I
said
do. How?
It's somehow, you were talking specifically about slavery, and I don't care about, I mean, slavery's not the point here. It's because it's the how this happened. It's like, so slavery somehow, the end of slavery somehow got turned into a means of promoting and became profitable, even more profitable for capitalism. And we can say somehow the corporation got hold. And what's the relationship between that word somehow and your entire big, beautiful book?
I hear what you're saying. And I think that, again, when we look at the underlying value, what is that somehow? The somehow is that we live in a society with its roots in Western Europe that's now become a global, globally prevalent, which is based on the core values of competition. The humans are meant to be what they call, selfish maximizers of their own financial needs. A society that applies status to what somebody is earning, how much they're consuming, how much they can be seen to be consuming, and that destroys some of the core values of what humans actually evolved to live according to, which is things like community, connection with each other, connection with the natural world, even connecting within ourselves. And I think that when we look at how slavery got co-opted into basically just a new form of capitalism, or how even, some of the advances in social concepts in the last few decades got co-opted more into capitalism, it's because those underlying values are still how people live their lives according to. Those are the rules by which people live their lives. Those are also the messages people get from when they're infants looking at a television screen or a video screen to all the time, every day as we watch the news. The messaging that comes at us all the time is messages like humans are fundamentally selfish. We are meant to compete against each other and outdo each other. Our society is happy when it's growing more. Growth is good. We can grow indefinitely. Don't even think about any limits to that growth. And we can grow through what this kind of notion of freeing markets and freeing society so that wealthy billionaires can do whatever they want. And ultimately that's good for all of us because it enables more growth. And these are some of the fundamental both values that we get inculcated in us and the rules according to which we live our lives unthinkingly. And both those values and those rules have to change for us to shift the trajectory of that. And they can change. It's doable.
So what I'm hearing you say is the image that was coming to mind as you were saying all that is that there are layers. And these layers are going to be miscible some. There's, it's not just the bottom layer, but sometimes the bottom layer moves up through the next two layers. You have all these layers of beliefs and patterns. And if you can have the pattern, or you can have the pattern that says it is acceptable to enslave others, and that belief system, and then you can chip away at that. But if you still have and so you outlaw slavery within a nation, but if you still have the belief below that whites are fundamentally superior to African Americans and the belief that those with white skin are entitled to the labor and lives of those with other color skin, then you've gotten rid of chattel slavery, but you still have this pattern beneath that they are entitled to their labor and lives. And so as long as that other layer still remains, it will find some new way to manifest itself. Am I understanding you correctly?
I think you're describing it really beautifully clearly, Derrick. And then you can keep going down those layers. And so you can imagine certainly like the world as it maybe fleetingly felt like when Obama was elected president. A world, and we can imagine even in a positive direction of some of those cultural norms going forward. Like imagine a world where it's generally agreed on that there is no difference between people based on the color of their skin, and that where that kind of horrendous racial prejudice has become so weak that it's no longer dominant in driving society. But as long as you still have some of these fundamental capitalist precepts, which basically says that, each person should like the right way for a society to work is for people to compete against each other, and that there's something intrinsically good about each person seeking their own end at the expense of others because it leads to a more efficient society and a more efficient economy, and that's ultimately good for everyone. As long as those underlying implicit patterns of thought remain, we'll still be in this trajectory towards complete collapse of our civilization and disaster for the natural world. So something has to shift where we look at some of these deep underlying values that our capitalist system is based on, and make new rules up to control the corporations based on those, on a different set of values, and also instill, cause media to change so that those destructive values are not instilled in our children from the various earliest times that they begin to make sense of things.
So what I hear you saying now is that even if we were able to get rid of this sort of overt racism, that, well, shoot, I just won't exploit the African Americans. Instead, I will exploit the Syrian refugees who are coming over who are desperate for a job, or the people from Mexico, or poor white people. Doesn't matter to me as long as it's cheap labor.
That's right, and that's how the world currently works. So that but basically nations will compete against each other just to try to entice some corporation to open some new manufacturing facility in their country to get the pollution and to get virtual slave labor, just because they're so desperate to compete in this marketplace where it's the corporations who essentially choose what they do and essentially make their own rule books.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and you have very brilliantly, I think, discussed the somehow of the co-optation, and can you now for 10 minutes discuss the somehow of moving away from this, considering that those with this perspective own the major forms of media, they own, considering the effectiveness of their propaganda. So somehow we need to change these values and help people. I love the line, unquestioned assumptions are the real authorities of any culture. And it's one of the beautiful things that your book accomplishes, is that you help us to question some of these assumptions. And so how do we do this, and how do we somehow move people or help people move themselves to perceiving the world in these different ways, and then that also manifesting in the real world? Yeah,
such important and profound questions, Derrick. And I think the first place for each of us to begin is really looking at our own unquestioned assumptions, which is obviously hard to do because the very fact that they're unquestioned makes them very difficult to even identify. Just like we're saying about the constellations. Once you see these constellations in the sky, you don't even realize there's other stars out there to even look at. So I think that all of us have to look at what is it in our lives, what are the ways in which we are choosing values, choosing what we do that has been ingrained in us as part of this dominant system and that is destructive. And of course, many of the people listening to this kind of discussion have already done a lot of that work and are aware of some of the fundamental things that need to be reoriented and have already changed a lot of things in their lives. And that's where we have to recognize that because these big corporations own the mass media, it is so incredibly important for us to work on the power of the network, the power of our self-organization as human beings to relate to each other and to work together, even if it's below the surface. You know, an analogy that I really love is this sense of, you know, in a forest, when you're walking along a forest, you can see the trees, and if a big tree falls down, everyone can see that. You know what's going on. But what you don't know is happening is this mycelial network, this fungal network below the earth, where the trees are communicating with each other, where they're actually helping each other, and they're actually using these networks to transmit carbon and different nutrients from one tree to another, and there's all this kind of communication going on, and that's the thing that actually allows the health of the forest. And I think we as humans are involved in these kind of mycelial networks through things just like what we're doing today, and kind of conversations with each other, helping each other to become aware of what's going on. And when we do that, I think what's so important is to not judge others, to not make them feel bad about the ways in which they are engaging in destructive behavior, because then that just leads to further separations. It leads each people to close off. But to really connect with people's sense of humanity, with their sense of kindness, their sense of these deep human virtues of empathy and compassion, and really bring people into that mycelial network, invite them into recognizing that we can do things in a different way. There are possibilities for us, and then begin to offer some possibilities, visions of what is possible, a world that is really different from the one we live in today.
I think, well, thank you for that. And we have like 2 or 3 minutes left. Can you, to sort of wrap up, do you have any workshops coming up? Do you have, how can people learn more about your work? And also, I'm going to throw in a joker here, that as well as that, how can people move from the level of these personal mycelial networks to organized political action? And I'm sorry to drop the big one in.
I love that, and I'll try to get to all of that in just 2 to 3 minutes. But yeah, thank you. Thanks for that, Derrick. And I guess first off, if anybody wants to kind of connect with me and my work, a good place to begin is my website, jeremylent.com. And if you want to look at a different kind of worldview that I'm talking about, one that can lead to a sustainable flourishing, I have another website to do with Liology, liology.org. That's liology.org, which you might find really interesting. Something that I do have coming up fairly soon, if anybody happens to be in Seattle, I'll be in conversation with David Corton in Seattle on Sunday, February the 25th. But that's and also in March in Sonoma in California, I'm co-facilitating a series of 3 workshops on just this issue, on transition in culture, understanding the patterns and reshaping them for a flourishing future. So you can find more information on my website about that. And if you happen to be in the area, that would be great. And, you know, to answer that bigger question, how do we, if we have these different values and we want to kind of plug in to what is possible, I do think it's important to connect up with organizations that are out there, that are doing really important things to kind of to shift where we're going. And one, I'll just give a plug for one that most people may not have heard of, and it's to do with specifically with climate change, but it's works at a much deeper level. It's called climate mobilization. You can find it at climatemobilization.org. And what I love about them is that they are recognizing that we are hitting an absolute existential crisis. And we can't just be looking at incremental changes. And what we have to do is mobilize society. And they use this kind of metaphor, what FDR did after Pearl Harbor in 1940 in the U.S., where he transformed society in order to face an existential threat. And that's what we need to do to look at our, face our world now. And so I love the way that they're shifting this kind of metaphor of meaning, in a way that I think Americans around, even outside of the environmental movement can get and understand.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for your work. And I would like to thank listeners for listening. My guest today has been Jeremy Lent. This is Derrick Jensen for Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network.